Hello, everybody. Could I just ask one of you to unmute and just let me know if you can hear me okay? Anybody?
Yeah,
Jessica, thank you. I only saw it. I don't know if that was Jessica, but so are we all okay? So can you unmute again, Jessica?
yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, and you can see me.
Yeah,
Brilliant. Thank you. Well, welcome everybody. Hopefully you have seen my face at least before on the short recording that I posted on Canvas. If you do go on to the Canvas module for this section of lectures relating to Latin American cinema, there is a short introductory video that I posted there. So do go and have a look at that if you haven't already. You'll also see that there is material relating to next week and the following week's lectures, which won't be delivered like this synchronously. They're recorded, so you can watch those as soon as you like. What I would suggest, though, is that you access the first of the lectures. They will specifically deal with a film called The Trespasser, which is a Brazilian film. So it would be a good idea to watch the first lecture and then watch the film before you certainly watch the film before you access the second lecture, or it won't really make much sense to you. But all the instructions are there about the order in which you should do things. So just make sure you access that. If anybody's got any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. However, simple the question might be. Often they're things that I've overlooked and forgotten to say that are quite simple and necessary. So by all means, just email me anytime. My email details are on Canvas, but if you haven't seen them, it's just lisa.shaw@liverpool. But do feel free to contact me at any time, particularly if you're interested in doing an assignment, the essay related to this topic. I'd be very happy to look at a plan and to help you, guide you through preparation for that. Claire Taylor, who you'll know is the module convener for this module, has asked me also to remind you that there is an assessment due relatively soon. She is going to post a reminder on Canvas today, and I think you probably will receive that by email too. Okay, so any problems, you can either contact me or if it's about the module in general, don't hesitate to contact Claire Taylor, who is very approachable as well. Okay, so as I said, we're going to be focusing in subsequent lectures that are pre-recorded on a relatively recent, I always think it's recent, but it's not that recent now, a Brazilian film from 2002, so probably not recent to you, probably before you were born, called The Trespasser, in Portuguese, O Invasor. But what I'm going to do today is to provide you with a kind of very general overview of the context of Latin American cinema as a whole. So not just Brazil, but the main film cultures or industries in Latin America. So it's a kind of very rapid overview of the history of cinema, particularly in 3 countries in Latin America, which have the most established film industries, which are Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil. I would encourage you all, obviously, to further the study of your languages, Spanish, maybe Portuguese, if you're interested in doing that too, or you've already started Portuguese this year, to try and watch as many films from the region as you can. I will mention quite a lot of examples of films that I would recommend that you see today. I did a quick look on Netflix recently to see what was available on there. There are some, and they come and go. So if you've got access to Netflix, obviously in the library, everything that I mentioned today, we've got copies of. So hopefully when we can get back into the library physically, you are encouraged to borrow DVDs, take them home, maybe get together with a group of friends, and it's a really useful exercise, not just in learning about Latin American cinema and whether you'd like to study film modules next year and in the final year, but also just to improve your language skills. I studied Spanish, French, Portuguese at university, and we were really encouraged to watch as many films as possible in the foreign languages, and it was so difficult in those days. We didn't have access, there was no internet, can you believe that? And we used to have to go to a local art house cinema. If there was a French film, it was like massively exciting. And now you've obviously got a lot more material at your fingertips. So just to get a flavour, you know, it can be doesn't have to be highbrow film. It can just be, you know, a romantic comedy or a thriller or whatever. But hopefully today, some of the ones that I mentioned might spark your interest. You may well have seen some of these films or heard of them already. I think certainly some of the directors that I'm going to mention, you will know their work in Hollywood, because some of them have made films in the English language as well as in their native Spanish and Portuguese. So what I'm going to attempt to do now is to share a PowerPoint with you. So if you just bear with me. Okay. Again, could I ask Jessica, who was very kind, would you mind just telling me whether you can see that image that says Latin American Cinema, an Introduction?
There's nothing on my screen.
Nothing on yours, right? Thank you. So I'll try again. Thank you. Hold on. Oh, I think I've just done something fairly obviously wrong here. Hold on. Right, okay. Sorry again, Jessica. Can you see it now?
No.
No. Okay. I think we've done it now.
Yeah, I can see it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I don't know who that was, but thank you, Jessica. Sorry, you were just the one name that I saw, so thanks. So if anybody can't see it, would you like to unmute now? And I'll just assume if nobody says they can't see it, we're okay to go. Okay, so this opening slide is an image from a film that you may have heard of and you may have seen. And again, it's one of the ones in the library that you can borrow, called The Motorcycle Diaries. It's an interesting, very interesting film. If you're interested in South America, I would really encourage you to watch it. It makes you want to hop on a plane as soon as we can. Here we've got an image, obviously, of Machu Picchu in the Andes in Peru. And we've got a very famous actor from Mexico on the right-hand side here, Gael Garcia Bernal, something of a heartthrob, who has starred in several of the films that I'll be mentioning today. And the interesting thing about this film, it's very much a co-production of various Latin American countries. So the director is actually Brazilian, Walter Salles. The main actor who plays the young Che Guevara, the Argentinian revolutionary who we associate with the Cuban Revolution primarily, is a Mexican actor. And it was filmed in various countries in South America. So it's a really, really excellent film. And I would encourage you to watch that. And it's also a really good example of the recent trend for co-productions between different Latin American countries, often with Spain involved as a co-producer and a financer as well. So that's something of a trend that we've seen recently. It's also a good example of the kind of type of Latin American film that's been produced in the last 20 years or so. So these are films that have been designed to be commercially attractive, so to attract an audience, not just art house audiences, but a mainstream audience, largely through engaging with your age group, really. So aiming at through the choice of storyline, the actors, the cast, the soundtrack. Often they incorporate contemporary music from Latin America, urban music, and so on, to aim to attract not just a Latin American youth audience, but a global youth audience as well. So this film was widely distributed in the UK. I think I saw it at the cinema first of all. So if you're interested, that's The Motorcycle Diaries. Let's go to those. Okay, so I thought first of all, I just wanted to emphasize that obviously within one lecture, we're not going to be talking about the film history of every single Latin American country. So I'll be focusing on what are known as the big three, the three nations within Latin America which have had a long-standing film industry and which continue to be the most important producers of films in terms of number and quality, although obviously there are exceptions of successful films that have come out of other countries like Chile and Cuba as well. So we're going to be concentrating on Argentina, Brazil and Mexico. And just to give you a bit of an idea about the history of film in Mexico, basically throughout the 20th century, but particularly from the 1930s, which was when the technology for sound cinema was invented in Hollywood and found its way to Latin America. So there were silent films in Mexico, Brazil and Argentina, but really the film industry as such didn't take off until the technology for making sound films arrived in the early 30s. So it's no coincidence that in Mexico, like in Argentina and Brazil, it was really the 1930s and 40s which were the boom of the first wave of national cinema in these countries. And there were very often political links between the government of the time and the film industry. This in the form of incentives to make film, because film was being very much seen as a national project, something that would sort of engender a sense of national identity within each of these nations. And it was a sense of pride. The thing to remember is that particularly what sort of more elite audiences in these countries would have already been consuming Hollywood films. So Hollywood was already exporting its products to these three countries in the silent era and in the 1930s and 40s. So these film industries that emerged in the Mexico and Argentina and Brazil were competing with Hollywood. So it was seen as being a way of asserting the national pride of these countries to create their own films rather than the imported Hollywood product that was obviously dubbed or subtitled in the local language. So in Mexico, what we call the golden age of the film industry really took off in about 1940 and came to an end in 1954. And the posters that you can see here really signify the two major trends of this golden age of filmmaking. So on the left-hand side, we've got this very famous film starring a very famous film star of the era, a woman called Maria Felix, but also a woman called Dolores del Rio, a Mexican, both massive Mexican stars who also, in the case of Dolores del Rio, went to Hollywood as well. So this was a film, La Cucaracha, which was based on a female soldier in the Mexican Revolution. So they often had a patriotic theme, like the Mexican Revolution in particular. But they were melodramatic, so that they often sometimes included music as well, and usually a love story. So there was a kind of drama, but also this melodramatic quality to them, and they were extremely popular. On the right-hand side, most Mexicans even today would recognize this actor and this character. So the actor's name is Mario Moreno, and he had a stage name that was Cantinflas, and he was probably the most famous actor to come out of this golden age of Mexican filmmaking. He was a comedian. He started his career in the circus, which was very popular in Mexico, and he made the transition from circus into the first sound films. So there's a massive host of Cantinflas films right throughout the 40s, in the 50s in particular. If anyone is interested or develops an interest, I've got a whole collection of DVDs of Cantinflas that I brought back from Mexico, and I've never done anything with them. So if anyone's got a burning ambition to do any research about him, or just interested in watching them, I'd be very happy to lend you those when we can get back on campus. So he obviously embodied this tradition of comedy film. Again, sometimes they had musical elements as well. So there are lots of similarities with what's going on in Brazil and Argentina at the same time. So again, We have an image here in the background of the leader, the president of Brazil from 1930 to 1945, whose name was Getúlio Vargas. He actually became a dictator in 1937. So the last stage of his premiership, between 37 and 45, he was a dictator. And he again saw the power of cinema, particularly national, homegrown Brazilian film, as a way of bringing the nation together to foster a sense of Brazilianness, as he called it, and of trying to create a belief in the nation, a sense of optimism through film. Again, this has to be seen very much in context of the influx of Hollywood films that Brazilians would have been watching at the cinema. And at this period, particularly the early 30s, we're talking about elite Brazilians who could afford to go to the small number of cinemas that were in existence. But very rapidly, by the early 40s, Brazil, there was a massive boom in film cinema building, and cinema access became very much democratized. There were cheaper cinemas in working class areas that catered for a more popular audience. They were actually called poeiras, which means dust bowls, so because they were usually quite dirty. They had a reputation that you would catch fleas if you went there, but that wasn't just true of Latin America. Even in the UK, I remember talking to some of my older relatives, and they said, oh, that was the flea pit that we used to go to in Liverpool. That was our local cinema because it was the cheap one. And it used to be sprayed for fleas before they went in to watch the matinee as children. So there was a democratization of access to cinema through the construction of cheaper cinemas, not just these beautiful picture houses for the elite. So yes, Vargas as president really realized that cinema could be a very powerful way of creating national propaganda to increase his own popularity and also to bolster this sense of Brazilianness, which was a made-up name, a neologism, as we call it, Brasilidade in Portuguese. The main tradition in Brazil from the mid-30s throughout the 40s and 50s was a tradition known as the chanchada. Chanchada actually was a pejorative term. It meant something that was lowbrow, not very good quality, aimed at the popular audiences. And it was a term that journalists used to talk about these first Brazilian musical comedies. So they were comedy films, but they always had an element of music to them as well. And the chanchada tradition dominated film production in Brazil throughout the 40s and 50s. It only really went into decline with the introduction of television in the mid to late 50s and the decrease in people going to the cinema. So the word chanchada, although it was pejorative and it meant something that was of low quality, it eventually became a neutral term. So it's now used to refer to a tradition of musical comedy that existed in this period, but it's not necessarily pejorative anymore. So here's an example. This is a film poster from a sort of typical classical chanchada from 1952. And I chose this one as the title tells you a lot about this tradition of musical comedy. So these were films that were very much associated with the annual carnival, particularly in Rio de Janeiro, which was the capital of Brazil until 1960. And Rio was also the heart of the film industry. So the carnival, which you'll all have heard of and maybe seen images of in Brazil, has always been a very powerful festival and set of imagery throughout the 20th century. So what these filmmakers did was basically just use the music of carnival, so typically samba music, but also a tradition called the Carnival March or the Marcha. And they incorporated this music into the soundtrack of these musical comedy films. So the films themselves were released to coincide with Carnival. So in the period before Lent every year, so usually about February, sometimes March. So they wouldn't be produced there wouldn't be massive numbers of films. There may only be one of these films produced every year, but they were massive successes. So they were launched to coincide with Carnival. They used popular songs that people were singing in the run up to Carnival because they'd heard them on the radio. So the soundtrack was really important to attracting audiences. And the other notable thing is that the cast members were very often established singers who were known to the audience via the radio. So many people from this era have said that they went to see these films because they were intrigued to see what these singers actually looked like, because they were very familiar with hearing them on screen and on the radio. Here on the right, we have one of the famous female performers. Her name was Eliana. She only needed one name. She was so famous. And the man is a comic actor called Oscarito, and he formed part of a double act with Grand Otelo. And the interesting thing is that Oscarito is a white Brazilian, whereas Grand Otelo was an Afro-Brazilian. So between them, they kind of were very useful representatives of the whole of the nation of Brazil. So that, you know, the white that tend to be the more privileged, well off, and the lower class that often tended to be Afro-Brazilian because of the legacies of slavery and racial inequality in Brazil. So I'm just going to show you a very brief clip just so you get a sense of the kind of, we're talking about black and white films, low budget, very low quality by today's standards, but I just wanted you to get a sense of what these films looked inside.
No tabuleiro da baiana. Patapá, oi, caruru, muda, oi, tempo, ai, oi, oi. E se eu pedir, você me dá o quê? O seu coração, seu amor de ai, 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 ai. No coração da baiana também tem sedução.
Okay, so just to give you a flavour, obviously, if you're keen, you can go and watch the whole clip in your own time, because I am going to put this PowerPoint obviously onto Canvas as well. So if we move on to Argentina, again, many similarities with what was happening in Brazil and Mexico. The golden age of Argentine cinema, as it's known, began again in the 1930s. The difference is that this boom, if you like, or golden age, came to a halt with the outbreak of the Second World War, because Argentina joined the side of the Axis, so the Nazi Germany. So if you think about what that meant, they were therefore the enemy of the United States, Britain, and so they didn't have access to the film stock. So the actual celluloid on which film was recorded in those days came from Hollywood, and that prevented them from continuing this boom in their film industry. So it cut it short. Argentine cinema from this period is again dominated by musicals, but also the melodrama genre. And they very much again drew on the national tradition of music in Buenos Aires in particular, which was, of course, the tango. Again, I won't play it now, but there's a clip here that you can look at from a film, a classic example of the tango melodrama called Cuesta Abajo, Downhill, which starred the very famous tango singer Carlos Gardel, who went on to have a career in Hollywood and in French film as well. So I'll skip the clip and you can watch that in your own time. So things really changed in Latin America in terms of cinema in the 1960s. So until then, there had been a very commercial, as you can see, popular cinema as entertainment. And things changed dramatically in the 1960s when there was a real backlash against this commercial cinema. So the political background to this obviously is important. There was an increase in politicization of particularly the younger generation, your age group, in the 1960s. If you think about what's going on in the region, we've got in Cuba the Cuban Revolution, so the rise of left-wing socialist Marxist ideas. And this was also true among the younger generation of university-educated university students in Brazil as well. So there was a backlash against capitalism as a financial and a development model, an embracing of the socialist model, particularly in Cuba. And obviously the anti-capitalist feeling extended to an anti-Hollywood feeling and an anti-commercial cinema. So what we get then is this small movements growing up in, particularly in Cuba and Brazil, among this young intellectual, university educated, Marxist, socialist group, of a series of small, initially small, but they grew to be very important, oppositional cinematic movements. So they were opposing the status quo. They were challenging this commercial cinema and the might or the ideology of Hollywood as well. So the movement in Cuba is known as Cine Imperfecto, imperfect cinema. The name is interesting in itself. We'll come back to that. And in Brazil, it was called Cinema Novo, or new cinema. So there are lots of parallels between those two movements. So Cine Imperfecto in Cuba was very much linked to the Cuban Revolution. Here in the background, you've got an image of Fidel Castro, and you'll know that Che Guevara, who we mentioned at the beginning, although Argentinian, was very instrumental in collaborating in the Cuban Revolution to throw out the capitalist model and to bring in the socialist regime. And the revolutionary leaders like Guevara and Castro were very well aware that if they wanted their political project to succeed, given the high levels of illiteracy, over half the population couldn't read or write in Cuba in 1953, film was an excellent way of reaching the masses with their message, particularly film in Spanish, obviously, that could be understood, so not imported film. So it's interesting that in the very first decree, cultural decree of the new revolutionary government of Cuba, they created this organization which still exists today, the ICAIC, which is the Cuban Institute for the Film Industry and the Film Art. So it's still very important, and it still controls and promotes film making in Cuba, right from production through to distribution and exhibition. So it's not a model that is taken from Hollywood. It's the reverse of that. It's basically it's run by intellectuals and artists, and there's no commercial motive. So the idea is not to make profit from filmmaking, but it's to educate. The other idea of Cine Imperfecto was that the audience was required to be active. So film wasn't a passive activity. It wasn't simply a way of entertaining people and not challenging them. So film was challenging. It was to make the audience think and to engage with politics via film. So the way that they did this was to often use open endings. So there's no neat resolution to a film, like a neat Hollywood plot. The films are deliberately thought-provoking. So they're challenging the audience to make sense of them and to think about the wider meaning and the meaning for their everyday lives as well, and politics. So they often use what's called discontinuity editing. So they're not linear. It's not a logical, chronological order with a nice, neat denouement or neat finale where everything's explained and all the loose ends are tied up. It's the opposite of that. They often mix media and genre. So you'll find that some of these classic films of the movement were a mixture of fiction and documentary, and often you weren't quite sure which sections were which. There was this sense of chronological confusion. So these films often require 2 or 3 viewings to make sense of them. If you're interested, the classic example, again, you can access this when we can get back to the library, is called Memorias del Subdesarrollo, which was Memories of Underdevelopment of 1968. The director's name you have there, Gutierrez Alea. So it's seen as the classic example of imperfect cinema in Cuba. In Brazil, the parallel movement, New Cinema, Cinema Novo, was very much influenced by the French and Italian new wave movement, so neo-realism in Italy of the 1940s, 50s, and the Nouvelle Vague, or the new wave of France, slightly later, late 50s, 60s. It's more definable than Cine Imperfecto from Cuba, because the filmmakers in Brazil actively coined this name, the term Cinema Novo, new cinema. So they had a kind of manifesto, if you like, a political manifesto or an agenda, which involved cinema, but it also stretched to embrace ideas about politics and social structure, particularly social equality, as well as aesthetic change in terms of the content of cinema and the way that films were made. Again, the directors were usually young university students or recent graduates. Often they were film journalists, Marxist or certainly socialist leaning, and usually they worked in film criticism as well. And probably the most famous example of the filmmakers of this generation who fits the bill of this description completely was somebody called Glauber Rocha. So if you're reading about Cinema Novo, you will come across his name. And he wrote a landmark essay. So as well as being a filmmaker, he was a kind of intellectual. He published in the press and in books as well. He wrote this essay called The Aesthetics of Hunger. And what this did was it was a kind of manifesto of what he thought the third world, as it was known then, so developing nations, as we'd call them now, like Brazil at the time, other parts of Latin America, what kind of film nations like this should be making, bearing in mind that they weren't competing with the first world, for example, the US and Hollywood, so-called civilized, but very much in inverted commas there. So his view was that the countries like Brazil and Cuba had a different message to deliver through film. So they shouldn't just be copying Hollywood, which was really what the film industries of South America and Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, they'd really been copying the Hollywood model, like the melodrama, the musical, and adapting it to the local context by using tango, samba music. What the Cinema Novo group advocated was reject the Hollywood model and do something exciting, original. So there was also a phrase that was coined that was an idea in your mind, a camera in your hand, filming ordinary people. So it was the idea that anybody could make a film. It was simple, cheap to make. You didn't need a big studio production. In fact, they were against studio filming. It was all about location shooting, filming real life. So not professional actors. So what they called non-professional actors, basically ordinary people. So there was a strong documentary quality, and that anybody with an idea in their mind could make a film. They also rejected the glossy, big budgets of Hollywood. So instead, they advocated filming on black and white film stock, even when colour film was readily available. They rejected the studio system and the very sophisticated technology, and advocated the handheld camera. So hence the camera in your hand. Anybody could grab a small camera, the equivalent of what we would have a camcorder today. In those days, it would be like a small cine camera. You could go anywhere with it. You could go into a shanty town, a favela in Brazil. You could go into the Amazon rainforest. You could go into the rural areas of the backlands of Brazil, and anyone could make a film on location, in shooting ordinary people. So no stars, no soundtrack, no additional music, the use of natural light, so no embellishments, and poverty and the inequalities of Brazil were a central theme of their filmmaking. So the classic example is a film called Barren Lives, Vidas Secas in Portuguese. It was based on an earlier novel. And basically, it's the image that you see here in the background. It's about the life of a poor peasant family living in the very arid interior of the northeast of Brazil and barely surviving due to the drought and the social inequalities of the landowning system in Brazil. The director, Nelson Pereira dos Santos, who only died a couple of years ago, again went on to be one of the main filmmakers of the Cinema Novo movement. So here's a still from the film. I'll give you a very brief clip to give you an idea of what we're talking about here.
Vai pegar fogo. Não adianta esperar.
Okay, so as you could see there, very slow paced. The idea of this, the filmmaker, when he made this film, excuse me, he said that he wanted the experience of watching that film to be as uncomfortable as the lives of the people depicted. So there's obviously, you may get a sense there that there's a strong documentary quality, even though we're not sure in some cases whether these are real people who've just been taken from this lifestyle, or whether they have been cast as semi-amateur actors. The other thing that's striking in that clip, as well as the drawn out length of the takes, and it's a very long film, it's over 2 hours, and it is a very anti-commercial film. It's not supposed to be entertaining. It's supposed to make you think about who are these people, and the intention was to make the elite Brazilians of the big cities, who were very privileged, who would probably see this film in an art house cinema or at a university in the 60s, who'd never been to this part of Brazil and certainly couldn't identify with the lifestyle of these poor peasants. So it was trying to make those people aware that this was going on in Brazil, even if they didn't know about it. So there was a strong political dimension to challenge that status quo, to make people think and to act politically and socially, to bring those inequalities to into the light and to challenge them. The irony is, however, that these films were sort of anti-commercial and they didn't attract big audiences, so they tended only to be seen by small art house cinema circuits. And also, they were much more popular abroad than they were in Brazil, so they were particularly embraced by the French intellectuals of the era. So many Brazilians would never have seen those films. So there was a certain kind of irony and a problematic dimension to their mission, because they weren't reaching the public. So if we leap forward then from the 1960s to the contemporary period, so from the 1990s onwards, really, we have major revivals of film industries in the three big countries that we mentioned earlier: Mexico, Argentina, Brazil. And these revivals of the film industries have continued to the present day. So we're really talking about the 1990s into the present. There have been major commercial and critical successes from all three countries. So in a sense, what we've seen in those earlier phases, initially we saw in the 30s and 40s and 50s, commercial cinema that was popular. People did go and see it. They were popular to all levels of society through that model of either the melodrama or the musical, and also through that copying of Hollywood models, really, but adapting them for the local context. However, there was no challenge to the political and social structure of Latin America. Then what we saw in the 60s were these oppositional cinemas that were trying to challenge Hollywood, anti-commercial, trying to politicize. But the irony was, the paradox was that they didn't really reach audiences in these countries because of their limited distribution. They weren't attractive to audiences either. So what's happened in the 1990s to the present day really is a coming together of both those things. So contemporary filmmakers have kind of realized that to get your message across, you have to really accept certain commercial models. So you have to appeal to audiences, which is why the Motorcycle Diaries, I think that first example from the first slide does this very well, because it appeals to a youth audience, it appeals to a global audience outside Latin America, as well as the youth of the region. But they are also trying to be critically successful. So they don't want to be escapist, sort of lightweight entertainment. They want to engage with serious issues and political issues, social inequality in the region, but to do that in a way that will engage audiences, because otherwise the message doesn't get across. So those two earlier traditions, I suppose, are melded together in this more recent way. That's not to say that there aren't escapist films being made and sort of romantic comedies and musicals and so on, but there is definitely a trend to try and bring those critical and commercial agendas together. Oh, it's a big spelling mistake there. It looks wrong. Argentina. If I spell that wrong, it looks wrong to me. I don't know, maybe sometimes when I look at things on screen, they just look like I spelt them wrong. Anyway, no, it looks okay, I think. So in Argentina, this recent boom really has been fueled by investment in film schools. So there's been a massive wave since the 90s of new higher education institutes, so the equivalent of universities and postgraduate courses and undergraduate courses in filmmaking. So this has led to a boom of new, youngish now directors, probably nearer my age than yours, that's for sure, but that grew out of this film school boom. So a very important female director, Lucrecia Martel, very interesting work. If you get, there's many of her films in the library, and two male directors, Daniel Burman and Pablo Trapero. So I've given you some examples here. Some of them have been very successful outside the region. El Secreto de sus Ojos was an Oscar winner, a co-production with Spain. That's one that you could probably get access to quite easily. What's interesting about that film is that it engages with the darker history of Argentina in the form of the dictatorship and of the 70s and 80s. So they revisit those political aspects of Argentine history, and the same is true of Brazil, but they do it through a more commercial oriented cinema, but they still manage to be critically acclaimed as well. So several examples there. I would encourage you to try and watch one or two of those. Nueve Reinas was very popular. It's a kind of heist film about a bank robbery. It's really interesting. So plenty to look at there. In Mexico, the boom has largely resulted from private investment in filmmaking. So there's been lots of new film production companies that have been investing in film production and have been very successful in terms of income and profit as well. So some of these you will have heard of, I hope. Maybe you've even watched them as part of your Spanish courses at school or college. Again, all available in our library. So these are films that were popular across the globe. Amores Perros and Y Tu Mamá También, both of them starring Gael García Bernal, who you saw playing Che Guevara in that first slide. There are three big filmmakers from Mexico who have dominated the boom in that country, but also made a massive impact in Hollywood as well. They're known as the Three Amigos, so you can, if you're interested, you can read up about them. The first is Alejandro González Iñárritu. You may well have heard of him as the director of Birdman and The Revenant in English language, but also Love's a Bitch, Amores Perros. Alfonso Cuarón, again, massively successful outside Mexico. Roma, I would encourage you to watch. I think that's available on Netflix, really important film. But he's also done English language films like Gravity and one of the Harry Potters. And also Guillermo del Toro, who you may have heard of The Shape of Water, which is relatively recent, and also Pan's Labyrinth, which he directed. So they've all had work and major successes at the box office far beyond Mexico, but they continue to work within the Mexican film industry as well. And if we move to Brazil, again, Brazilian filmmaking had reached a real crisis point before the mid-1990s. I think it was 1994. I don't think there were virtually no major feature films made in Brazil. So it had ground to a halt largely because the then government had removed all support for the industry. And then in the mid-90s, a new government introduced tax incentives. So basically, if you were the owner of a company, it could be any kind of company, say you owned a brewery in Brazil or a shoe manufacturer, if you wanted to invest your profit in filmmaking, you didn't have to pay tax on it. So it was a really good way of people to avoid tax, but also to potentially earn more money from investing in a film that was successful. So this gave rise to what's known as the retomada in Portuguese, which simply means rebirth or renaissance. So the retomada, which we'll be talking about in relation to the Brazilian film, The Trespasser, is the kind of boom, if you like, of Brazilian filmmaking since the mid-1990s. Some people say the retomada ceased in the early 2000s, but many critics say that it's kind of ongoing as well, that we're still seeing this boom. The interesting thing about films of the retomada in Brazil is that there are lots of various film themes and genre and traditions. So it spans crime thrillers, comedies, musicals even, but there are two very important dominant themes. The first is the representation and the setting of this area known as the sertão in Portuguese, which is precisely the area that we saw in that clip from Barren Lives. So it's the northeast of Brazil, this very arid, desert-like hinterland, very poor, the poorest region of Brazil, blighted by drought and social inequality, large landowners and poor peasant farmers like those we saw in that clip. So it's taking on board that setting, which was used in the 60s within cinema novo or new cinema, but it's making films in a much more commercially oriented form to attract audiences, but nevertheless it deals with those political and social themes. The other main setting and theme is the favela, a word that I think has found its way into English now, but roughly translates as sometimes shantytown or urban slum. This also featured in those cinema novel films, which exposed the great social inequalities of Brazil's cities. But now in the films of the retomada, this setting, which you can see in the background here on the slide, is coming back, but it's being dealt with in a very different tone and with different significance. So these are films about the favelas that are nevertheless commercially oriented, designed to appeal particularly to youth and global audiences. So one example that you may have heard of, again, you can watch this from the library, is City of God. It is a very violent film, so just be aware of that. If anyone's sort of wants any tips about films that perhaps aren't quite as violent, just contact me. Central Station actually is a good one. That's a film that exposes these inequalities of the cities of Brazil, excuse me, but it does so in a way that is much less violent and is a bit more of a melodrama, but nevertheless it shows how that melodramatic commercial form and genre of film still is being used today to expose some of these political issues and social issues as well. So there are two examples I would really recommend. And oops, sorry, the third is a film called Carandiru, directed by Hector Babenco, who's actually an Argentine director who took up Brazilian nationality. So you've got three of the main directors there. Carandiru is the name of a prison. So it's based on the true story of a major prison massacre, a riot that led to the massacre of the inmates of a prison in Sao Paulo in Brazil. So it's based on a true story. And this is where we come to The Trespasser. The Trespasser, the film that we'll be looking at, which I'd like you to try and find out a little bit more about before the next lectures and in preparation for the seminar. So you can do that by looking at what's on Canvas, first of all. Clearly, The Trespasser fits into this theme of urban life in Brazil, the exposure of the favela as a source of poverty that obviously has relationship with crime as well. But it's not glamorizing that, it's actually exposing those inequalities and those social problems and political problems, but doing so in a commercially successful format that will attract audiences. Okay, so I think that brings us more or less to the end of the session. So if anybody has any questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch, particularly if, you know, in due course you decide you'd like to write your essay or any other assessment in relation to this block of classes. I think you'll enjoy the film. It's probably a film that you need to watch maybe a couple of times, so maybe get together and watch it as a group if you can do that. If it's particularly if you know in shared accommodation, but do have a look at the material on Canvas, at least the first lecture before you watch the film. I think that will make more sense to you, and that will reinforce lots of the issues that I've spoken about today about contemporary cinema in Brazil and Latin America as a whole. So yeah, try and just enjoy it and you know, maybe watch it together so that you can exchange impressions. The plot is a little bit tricky at the beginning, particularly the ending of the film is a little bit difficult to kind of understand. So it might be better to listen to the first lecture before you watch it. So just drop me a line if you need any help, or you just want to discuss anything, or you even want some tips of good films to watch, and I'd be really happy to point you in the right direction. Okay,
so do you have other classes recorded already for us?
Yeah, they're on Canvas.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll double check that they're accessible. They'll probably only be accessible this week, but there'll be 2 recorded lectures on The Trespasser. But I wouldn't watch the second one before you've seen the film though, but I've kind of put all the instructions on there as well.
Okay, great.
Okay, but any issues, if you can't find anything, please just let me know. But welcome back everybody. I hope you all had a good Easter. Should have said that at the beginning. I hope you're all doing okay. Bye.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, bye.
Bye-bye.